Thank you, everyone. Welcome. My name is Regina Mayer. I serve as KPMG's Global Head of Clients and Markets, and I'm personally very passionate about the energy transformation. My previous role, I have 6 years as our Global Sector Head for Energy. And you'll notice that at KPMG, we use the word transformation because energy transition implies you move from one system to an entirely new system. And our belief is you have to transform all of the means of generating, distributing, and consuming energy in all of its forms in an effort to reduce carbon output and make the planet great again. So we're going to talk about how to do that in a just way, because it's going to be incredibly important not to leave anyone behind. Access to affordable, secure, reliable energy is a game changer relative to wealth creation, the eradication of poverty, dealing with food insecurity, improving education. The list goes on and on. So how do we achieve our climate objectives and heal the planet for future generations while we also bring everyone along? So we're going to talk about how to do that today. And there's no one better to lead this conversation than our very own Mike Hayes. Mike leads our Global Decarbonization Hub, and he's a great friend of mine. He has been educating me about the importance of the energy transformation and how we can get there. There's many lessons learned. I'm American, so I live in Houston, Texas, and you can see examples of where the transformation is working and where it's not working. I think California has some lessons learned in terms of potentially leaving underserved populations behind. So how we do that on a global scale is going to be absolutely critical. So with no further ado, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining KPMG at the ICE Village at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And over to you, Mike Hayes.
Thank you.
Round of applause.
Thank you very much, Regina. I'm not quite sure who was the student and who was the teacher in our relationship over the last 6 years. Really delighted to have this audience with us. In fact, I've met some of this audience at sessions yesterday, and there's one thing about this session that I really want to bring out. All of us are on one huge global endeavor to change the way we live, the way we work, and the way we operate globally. That's our mission, but what today is about how we do it. How we do it is going to be critical. If we get that piece wrong, we will not succeed with the ultimate objective. So today's session is in two parts. First of all, I'm going to be joined by Chris Close from WWF to talk about the role of WWF on the just transition, and most particularly about a big initiative that we launched at COP27 between UNDP, unfortunately Achim Steiner can't be with us today and he sends his apologies, and WWF, with KPMG as the initial founder and big supporter of the initiative. We're going to talk about that initially, and then we're going to open up into a panel discussion where I've got three different panelists who are going to bring different perspectives: a government perspective, an industry perspective, a professional perspective. And really, my mission is that we start going beyond just talking about the importance of the just energy transition. We need to understand, what does it mean, how do we implement it, and in particular, I want to see public sector participants in this discussion, but also energy companies and investors. They all have a critical role to play in this. So with that, I'm going to get going with the discussion. I'm going to look to my colleague Sam to tell me when about 15 minutes are up, 10 to 15 minutes, but because I've no doubt we're going to get into a really interesting discussion. Before we get to this new Alliance for Just Energy Transformation, help me build the connection between the work that WWF does, and I'm no doubt you're very involved in the nature and biodiversity issue, and link that with WWF's focus on the just energy transition.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Mike, and for organizing this event. It's really important to keep the momentum and keep the energy going. I think it's fundamental, and sometimes you think energy, climate, and biodiversity and nature, and we understood that those are totally interlinked, right? One crisis and the other crisis. If you have less nature, you will have issues on climate. If you have climate change, you have affecting nature. So for us, it's fundamental to tackle both issues at the same time, right? So that's for us. And also, we've learned from other experiences that you cannot solve one problem and create another one. So if you solve the energy problem and then you create a social problem, that's completely unaligned to what we want to achieve. So I think those two things more and more are hand in hand. So that's why for us, it's a fundamental priority to work on this.
So over the 6 months leading up to COP27, I worked with some of your colleagues in WWF and some incredible colleagues in UNDP to develop this concept called an Alliance for Just Energy Transformation. It was formally launched at COP27. Can you tell me a little bit about the Alliance and share with our audience? And on the screen earlier, we were talking about the 8 principles. But just give us an insight into what this Alliance is about, what it's trying to achieve, and what you think WWF's role is in this.
Sure. So I think, first of all, we've had a lot of experience of building alliances or roundtables in other sectors because we critically understand that one government, one company, one NGO will not solve the problem, right? And it will be ridiculously expensive if you want one to solve that, not even the UN, nobody. So alliances are fundamental, and the pace of change that we need is accelerated, right? And the investment also, it's high, we know that. But if we work together, it's not gonna be a big bill for anybody, right? So we're very pleased that UNDP, KPMG, and also EDF.
EDF, yeah.
GridWorks, sorry, I need to read this, ITUC, and REN21 are the funding members of this and really helping us give this scale and voice and amplification of this, right?
And we should say, actually, there's an open invitation to anybody who wants to join this. We want to create a movement around this and really help build frameworks and new way of thinking, because not a lot of people know how to actually implement the just energy transition in practice.
Exactly, and that's perfect because, I just wanted to show that it's not just us here in the stage, oh, we want to do this. No, there's a lot of other organizations already involved, and yes, we're calling everybody to join because the solutions needs to be co-created, inclusive, and also each country, each region, I think you were mentioning before, is different. So we need to adapt solutions to the different realities and different contexts, right? So it's about a transition at the local scale with different communities, with different realities that will lead to the global transformation that we want to achieve.
And I'm going to bring out an important point, Chris. It's local. The solutions vary from community to community, depending on the type of project you're talking about. And that, for me, is one of the real challenges. We can develop overall principles, but this comes down sometimes dealing with indigenous communities. Yeah. We might come back to this in the panel discussion. Sometimes it could be senior executives who no longer have a job, even though they've had a very successful career, because suddenly their business is not part of the energy transition. The sheer scale of this challenge should not be underestimated.
No, I'm Brazilian and I live in Brazil. And the reality there, there are hundreds and thousands of workers that depend on the traditional energy system, right? And for them to get education and re-skilled to what it means to be a worker at the green energy, it's really hard. We are seeing that, right? A lot of solar panels, wind shields, and all that being implemented. But I think we need to understand that, yes, there are different realities. There are communities in the front line. Education's level is hard. And also, let's not forget something that is really important, it's energy justice. If you don't even have energy, what are you going to transition to? So 46% of Africa don't have energy access, right? And so you need to understand, okay, that's not even a transition, that's an availability and making them, and if you kickstart from the beginning, from something that considers their social situation, their economic situation, gives them job, and is geared towards the energy, the green energy, right?
So I'm glad you brought up this question of energy access. I actually find it unacceptable that today, in 2023, depending on which report you read, somewhere between 800 million and 1 billion people do not have access to electricity. And, this session is not specifically about that, but I always think it's important to bring out that reality. That's causing problems in education, in food, poverty, health, and it's one of the really big social issues. And I know Regina and myself in KPMG have been trying to tackle this with some colleagues in WEF. A lot of that issue is around mobilizing capital and getting capital to work in that part of the agenda. I want to turn back to the question of the alliance and the whole concept of just energy transition. Maybe you might just give me a feel for, in practice, what sort of things do you think are important to actually implement, whether you're investors, energy companies, other stakeholders in this, to achieve the just energy transition?
Yeah, I think let's talk about 3 key stakeholders: governments, companies, and investors, right? So governments, it's about policy making. The system needs to change. But policymakers, and we've learned this with COP15, listen to companies. So if you as company leaders go and talk to your government representative and say, we need you to help to make just and social policies for the energy transition, they will listen and they will be part of the table and they will invite you and other social organizations to do that. So yes, advocate with these governments and involve in that process, right? Energy companies, of course, it's reskilling workers, is investing. So it's not just investing in technology. Many times we think, oh, it's innovation, invest in this technology, that technology. Yeah, great. But who's going to implement? What are going to be the people, the labor that's going to do that, right? And even, we were talking before with even, like you say, senior leaders, it's also understand that maybe you need to forget and relearn things because it's a new system, right? And investments. I think we all know there's billions of dollars gap to implement the energy transition, the biodiversity needs, the climate solutions that we need. And so really, and we know that finance wants that.
Yep.
So one thing important is they can come to the alliance that is representative from all the stakeholders and find in one place solutions. Because as an NGO, many times they say, oh, it's too confusing. We don't even know where to put our money. Okay, so that's why if we come together, we agree on the things, there are the principles, it's easier to then catalyze funding and investments to the right places.
So you've just explained the rationale why I and my colleagues in KPMG were so keen to be involved in the Alliance for Just Energy Transformation. And I've got some colleagues that I met yesterday from the B team, and I had this exact discussion. We need to bring the public and private parts of this agenda together. At the moment, we're not talking the same language, we're not sitting down together, and the more we can do that. So my real hope in this Alliance for the Just Energy Transformation is that public and private will work together, and we need to understand each other's perspectives because they are different, and that is a communication issue that we need to get our heads around pretty quickly.
Well, that's I don't know if I'm allowed to ask you a question, Mike.
Of course you are.
Well, you just said KPMG has motivation to do this, right? And that's really interesting. But what would you tell other organizations like KPMG or others that may not see, oh, it's an immediate role, right? Why is it important for KPMG and others like you to be here?
It's very, very simple. All of us, and what I love about being at Davos is we're with a community of people who are passionate about changing the world we live in. At the center of all of that is this concept of net zero, carbon free, whatever words you want to use. For me, it's really simple, and this is the message I give. We are not going to achieve that end result unless we immediately start thinking about a just transition. Communities, people, they care about this, and we need to bring them on the journey. This needs to be an inclusive transition. And I use that word inclusive so often. Just one final story. I did a webinar with Regina about 2 years ago principally made up of the oil and gas community. And I got a question that I couldn't answer. It was a gentleman who wrote something in the chat. And he said, I've been a geologist with a major oil and gas company for the past 35 years. He said, I get it. I get that we have to change, we have to transition. And he just said, what about me? And that left a mark for me. That, for me, said, we have to think about the just transition. And I can drive, and I spend my life working in renewable energy projects and climate projects. We're working with clients and colleagues all over the world on this mission. But what we need to do is bring this aspect into our considerations.
Yeah, and can I jump into that? Because if we don't do that, we have people against it.
This is the problem.
Right?
It'll stop us achieving it.
Exactly, and it can even lead to social unrest, right? And so people say, well, if it's going to affect my livelihood, I'd rather not change. This is fine, let other future generations deal with it. But if you involve them, then, I think it's really fundamental so that people feel part of it and not against it.
There's a number of colleagues and friends from the UK in this audience. I can remember back to the 1980s when the UK government tried to close the coal plants without involving the community. Yeah. You can see the unrest that led to.
Yeah.
So I'm sure we're way ahead of time, Sam, but maybe just to wrap up a little bit, what is your overall call to action to this group? And bear in mind, we have a very large audience who are live streaming into the session as well. Well,
very simple. And I try to do this because there's a lot of information when you come to Davos. If you can, right now on an email or first thing Monday when you get with your team, get somebody appointed as a project lead in your organization to look at this topic. And go to the website, panda.org/AJET. There's the link to if you want to be involved, if you want to join. But now, that's the most immediate, simple thing you can do as a leader. Send your team a note. This is interesting. We need to get involved and get on it. That's it.
Well, I think that's a really powerful message to wrap it up. Chris Close, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I would now like to invite the three panelists to join me on stage in no particular order. Minister Valles from Colombia, Minister for Mining and Energy, if you could join me up here. Surendra Patwari from Gemini Corporation, there you are. And Sarah Owen van der Sluis, who is an energy and infrastructure partner in KPMG. So we're delighted all three of you could join us today. So I've had a really, really interesting discussion with Chris Close on the WWF perspective. The passion and the importance of this has really been conveyed by Chris, so thank you for doing that. Surendra, I want to turn to you first of all. You've been doing recycling, circular economy, long before the term was probably even in use, going back, I think, to 1989. You've worked with and set up and led Gemini Corporation from your headquarters in Belgium. You are probably one of the leading circular economy companies in the world. I know you're heavily involved. You've been involved with SMI. You're an advisor to WEF. You're involved in so many different initiatives. I'm going to take a little bit of time with you, and I want to hear your story. And in particular, I want to hear how Gemini Corporation has actually been thinking about the social aspects of your business and how from a very early stage, what we now call just transition, you've actually, I think, based on my discussions with you today, you've incorporated and embedded that into your business.
Thank you, Mike, for asking me about the story of my company, Gemini Corporation, and the importance of social dimension in my business. I started this recycling company in '89 with one Belgian person 34 years back. And to be honest, ladies and gentlemen, I didn't know the word sustainability, neither did I know the word circularity when I started the business. In the beginning, like every other business, is always challenging. And at that time, the scrap business was not looked upon favorably. And I still recall the angry telephone call from my grandfather that you are going to be in waste business. Honest people never do waste business. And even if you make tons of money, he would think that I made it with unfair means by cutting corners, cheating on quality, weight, description. Well, somehow I could convince him. And since then, the story or the journey has been very exciting. Now, we do business in 60 countries. We give second life to 2 million tons of different kind of plastics, paper, waste, and other things. And we collect waste from over 500 locations every month. Again, to be honest, I didn't know that the business would assume such a big dimension. It would become as big as the GDP of India, almost $3 trillion of business, and it's increasing every day. And the sheer size of the volume is also incredible. Municipal waste is about 2 billion tons. And putting it in plastic perspective, every day we generate about 1 million tons of plastic waste, 1 million tons. And shamefully, and sometimes I say shamelessly, less than 10% is recycled. And on top of it, despite so many debates and discussions over the last 3 years, even from this forum at the World Economic Forum, the global plastic recycling rate is going down. It's going down. And why it's going down? Because there is no collection. The collection system is not working. Over 2 billion people do not have access to the waste management system. So what do? Here is the main point of our discussion. Do we leave it uncollected? Do we let it go to the landfill? Or we collect it or convert into either a product or an energy? That's the key point. Well, obvious answer is yes, we have to collect it. But how do we collect it? Particularly in the developing world, who is responsible for collection? And there comes the social point. The life and contribution of rag pickers or the waste pickers. I like to call them reclaimers to give dignity to their profession. I think the word rag pickers is not the right word. Oh, sorry. Could you hear me very well? Thank you. Well, I'd like to give them the word reclaimers to give dignity to their professions. So if we use the waste, well, before I go for that, of course, everybody would like that we must upcycle the waste, we must recycle, but the volume is so big that it's not possible to recycle. I can go in a longer terms, but the main thing is that we have to collect it and put it to use. And that would lead to more economic activities. And there are 15 million, that's what we believe, 15 million rag pickers in the world. Their livelihood would change, for sure. And besides, I think we have a responsibilities. So what we did back in India, we started thinking from the waste pickers' point of view, reclaimers' point of view. We thought of distributing and installing at their own premises, free of cost, as small baling machines. Well, here also there was challenge. They were wondering, the community was wondering, how come a Belgian-based company is giving free of cost something at their home? Do we have a hidden agenda? Somehow it took some time to convince them. And the story didn't end there. One of the conditions for installation was there should not be child labor. They have to give us the material at the market prices, every month certain quantities, and the payment would go through only the bank, no cash payment, which is common with air. But it was the child labor which was the most difficult. Went there to inspect, children were working. And you confront them, then they contend what they do in the evening. So we provided them games, televisions. That's how you have to handle these issues. And now I would like to happily say that we have installed such small machines at 40 locations across India. The collection has improved tremendously. And here is a perfect example of a great partnership between people, plastic, planet, and profit. Everybody is happy. Now the point comes, all the waste which has been collected, is it just to put it in energy? Is it a just transitions? And from my experience, it is just and fair. I'll explain you why. From the social point of view, as I explained, I think it's a great contributions to the societies, the marginalized societies. When you leave the waste uncollected, unhandled, it's the marginal society which is affected tremendously. And more than that, we have a responsibility, a big responsibility to our future generations, to the young people like you. On plastic side alone, the quantity would increase from 360 million tons waste as on now to over 1,000 million tons in next 40 years, 1,000 million tons. And if we don't do anything, the children would never forgive us. So we have a responsibility, a social responsibility. And also the SDG number 7 would surely be served with this waste to energy transition. And secondly, environmental point of view. Yes, there are debates. I would not say that it's clearly there are no issues. Yes, there could be emission of gases, but the technology is evolving so much, it's just a question of time that the waste to energy would have less harmful impact. But you cannot question the point that if we do not do actions, the environmental damage, you hear about the marine debris, the microplast, nanoplast, it's scientifically proven that we have to take care of the plastics. And last, the governance point of view, it serves the legal framework, it promotes the economy of circularity. As per American Chemistry Council, plastic to fuel facilities could give a job of number of 39,000 people, economic activity of almost 9 billions. So obviously, it's something every government would approve. So considering all aspects from this mode of energy generation, I sincerely believe that this waste to energy is fair and just in its impacts on the world. Thank you, Mike.
I think that does deserve I mean, for me, that story brings to life what we're talking about today. And the other point I'd make that you didn't make is that by doing the right thing, you actually created value. You created value for your company. We need to get that narrative across. This is not just about cost. This is about a positive contribution to society, but also creating value for people who invest in making this happen. Minister Velez, recently appointed, I believe, as Minister for Mines and Energy in Colombia. I'm really delighted you could join us here. You have the challenge that you've got to think about this at a multi-dimensional level. You have to think about it from a social justice level, from an economic growth level, and an energy transition level. How do you balance those three sometimes competing interests as part of your policy framework in Colombia?
That's a challenge that we have. And first of all, our government has decided to take the challenge. It will be a lot easier just to pretend that it's just about a technological change, changing one technology of energy generation for another. And what we came to realize is that we need to take the opportunity of this climate crisis to make a social change. We do that through democratization of the energy model. So that's our main purpose in the energy transition. And democratization for us implies to take into consideration access, because as the person just before mentioned, we have problems of access in the global south. And we cannot just pretend that transition can be done for those who doesn't have any electricity yet, or who has poor electricity, because it's also a matter of what is the quality of the electricity and what can you produce and what kind of economy, alternative economy can you produce with that energy that you have access to. But also what we are looking into is the possibility of communities to generate electricity as well. It's called comunidades energéticas, energy communities. But not only for self-consumption, but also to be able to put electricity into the grid. That implies for us the democratization of the whole model, and of course a change that is hopefully like speeding up the renewables in our country. In addition to that, we are also conscious of the fact that we have an economic model that is dependent on fossil fuels. So we have been a coal exporting government and country, and oil exporting government country. And now in order to contribute to the climate struggle, then we have to change our export model. And for that, we cannot do it alone. I mean, we don't have an industrialization in place. So something that we have to do in order to contribute to climate change is to industrialize our country. And for that, we need external support, because it needs investment in new sectors that are not the traditional extractivist sectors. And we are facing now some of the challenges of making that transition, for example, in the coal sector. During COVID times, the coal went down in the international prices, and some of the mines were closed as a decision by the multinational companies. And even though now the prices are up, those mines are still closed. And what we are facing in those regions is the social and economic crisis that we are going to continue facing in the coming years as the decarbonization in the global north is happening. So that for us implies to really take into consideration what are the differences between the global north and the global south in relation to decarbonization of the global economy. And we have very specific challenges in countries like ours, and we hope to have those challenges taken as global challenges, because otherwise we won't be able to actually make the change. So we are into the industrialization of the economy and the industrialization of the energy transition, so taking the opportunity of producing or assembling solar panels, for example, contributing with the industrialization of some of the minerals that are needed for the transition. And that kind of not only exporting, like taking minerals out from the ground to export minerals, but trying to make another layer in the economy so we can actually make the change. So
thank you for that. I've actually got two brief follow-up questions. I read with interest your prior career, which involved an element of filmmaking and human rights. To what extent do you see this as a human rights issue?
I have an example to illustrate a bit of how this relates to human rights. In the north of Colombia, we have a region called La Guajira. La Guajira is inhabited by the Wayuu indigenous communities, and it has been a place where coal mining has happened for 3 decades. Yet it is La Guajira the poorest department in the country, where children die of hunger every year. And the inequality is then the biggest in the country as well. So the 3 decades of coal mining hasn't proven to actually generate any wealth. On the contrary, like inequality is bigger, and there is a lot of social unrest and conflict and health problems and environmental problems and all sorts of human rights problems. So now we come to the opportunity of seeing this region from the angle of the new energy generation technologies. So this is a region that has a lot of wind and a lot of solar opportunities. So there is the possibility of changing the extractivist model to renewables. However, the renewables have come with the same model. So it is companies, private companies, not really seeing what the local communities are needing, not really involving local communities, actually through their projects generating more unrest. So we are, even though it is something that could improve the local communities' lives, is not doing it.
I just think that's a really important point, because we keep talking about the transition from fossil fuels to renewables, but actually there's a whole suite of new renewable energy projects being set up, and unless these developers actually embrace the community issues, this is why we need some sort of framework. We need to inform that these people, it's not good enough anymore just to build a new solar plant without taking the community issues. And that, going back to my discussion with Chris and the Alliance for a Just Energy Transformation, we really want to bring this issue back to investors, back to energy companies. They need to actually play this out in practice, and that's just a perfect example. I'm going to make one other comment before I will eventually get to you, Sarah. Don't worry, because I do want to hear the energy company perspective. And this is more of a comment from me. You made the comment, Minister Valles, about investment and investment from the global north into the global south. For me, in the work that I do, that is one of the single biggest issues. I talk to big investors all the time, and they say, help us find the investable projects in emerging markets. I talk to the emerging markets, and they say, we can't find the investors. There's a piece of work, and this is a big part of my mission on climate. We need to work harder to bring the capital and the projects together. If we can achieve that in emerging markets, and there is so much opportunity, and I'm only just making a comment here, sometimes the issue is perceived risk as opposed to real risk. Investors assume all sorts of risks, and I'll take a country like Colombia, when you get down to it, and I've worked on projects in Colombia, actually it's a very investable location, it's a very good location for investment, and we need to do more to communicate that message. Yeah. If you want to comment?
I agree, and I think the government has a lot to do in making that bridge. Because what has happened, I think, is that in order to facilitate investment, then the government has been very flexible in what can be the relationships between companies and communities, and that has gone wrong. Because at the end, there is abuse, there is not following up, there is very little opportunities for the communities to actually ask for their rights. So if the state is more present in the relationship, not only to facilitate investment, but to follow up what are the relationships between the investors, the companies, and the communities, then I think the process can be a lot smoother.
And that's the point, actually. We keep thinking that we just go to governments for capital. The capital is out there with investors. It's the governments can create the policy and the investment framework and environment to facilitate that investment. That's the challenge. I've completely sort of gone off the written agenda, but it's such an interesting discussion. Sarah Owen, I want to come to you. You are heavily involved in working with some of the major energy companies, particularly in the oil and gas sector. I know you're particularly passionate about the energy transition, passionate about climate justice, social justice. I'd love to get your perspective from the interactions you're having with the energy community. Are they really thinking about this issue? Are they hoping it's something that'll go away? Are they annoyed at people like me who say, you have to think about this? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So, look, this is an outside-in perspective on the energy sector, just to make that clear. And it is very live. I mean, this is maybe an obvious point, but energy is a very special kind of product in this whole debate, right? Because it is key to economic growth, it is key to human fulfillment, and it has historically been enormously carbon intensive. And I think energy companies know that they are in the middle of that juncture, and they have been in the middle of similar junctures for quite some time, right? They're not unfamiliar with the moral dilemmas of extractive industries around the world. I think the challenge is really to take two challenges. One is around the how, and we'll come back to that. But I think the other challenge is that many of us in the sector and outside the sector have been slow to realize that it's not just a nice to have, that we have some element of justice accompanying the business transactions that we undertake. That, in fact, if we collectively want to hit our net zero targets, we cannot do that without a social transition. So we cannot have an energy transition without a social transition. And I'll give you two examples. Neither of them, frankly, are quite as impactful as the experience of my fellow panelists, but I'll take a largely developed country example. So many developed countries are talking a lot about the cost of living crisis. And I appreciate that probably seems a bit facile if you don't have electricity, but forgive me. Cost of living crisis means there are substantial numbers of people in developed countries who cannot pay for the things, well, they may not even be able to pay for their own heating at the moment, but cannot pay for the upgrades that might need to be made to their homes to enable an energy transformation to happen. Another example, and this one really surprised me when I heard it, because it just shows how interdependent we all are around this just transformation. So we know there's been gas shortages or fear of gas shortages around the world, and particularly in Europe. Some of the supply for the European markets has come from lower demand in Asia because of the pandemic. Some of it has come as a diverted supply from countries like India, where those countries did not want to or could not participate at the gas prices that were being set globally, and have instead needed to resort to more coal. So I think we have to be enormously intentional about the connectivity both within countries or within societies and between societies if we're going to make this happen. And I think we also need to consider, and this is something I think that companies, back to your question, Mike, are grappling with, is I think each company is trying to think about how they set their own agenda and objectives in respect of the just energy transformation. So historically, this was really a matter of kind of don't mess it up and don't mess it up publicly, right? Don't do bad things. And for some companies, and I'm not in this category and haven't worked with any in this category, but for some companies, I think it was don't get caught messing it up. Whereas the tables have turned over the last few years, and in reality, the role of civil society and movements around civil society has changed the game, and companies now have to start to think very proactively about where they are on this spectrum. And I think it's no longer a matter of just demonstrate you're doing no harm. That's not enough anymore. I think it's very much about how do you demonstrate positive impact, and that involves a lot of very, very difficult choices. And I will also say that I'm not sure that finance, which is a big, broad category, but I'm not sure that investors in the corporate space are quite there yet in terms of some of the real implications of this for future business models and future investment models. I'll stop there.
So, a couple of comments, Sarah. Investors make investment decisions day one, and they look at the reality of the investment, they look at the financial metrics, they probably do some sort of ESG and climate assessment. The problem that I worry about is that this issue of social justice, just energy transition, is something that can impact projects, not just when they're being built, but further down the line when these projects are operational. And they can get some nasty surprises. They can get, we mentioned social unrest. It is a reality. Are investors, if you don't mind me saying so, a little bit slow to the table in understanding the full implications of what we're talking about here?
I think it's an emerging debate, right? I hate to say we're all on a journey. We're all on a journey, right? And investors are on a journey as well. I also think we have to be really careful about using the term investors or finance as if it's one single category. So for example, if you look at development capital and infrastructure projects, they are really live to lots of types of risks, including what they would call social risks. We're calling it just energy transition, but there's some important shared elements there. If you look at other types of corporate investors, honestly, I think right now there's a desire to have everything, and I'm being a little bit simplistic, but I don't think there's a recognition that there's going to be a cost, and maybe a significant cost, and maybe some rebalancing in terms of the returns that investors might be able to achieve purely measured financially in order to deliver some of the transformation that we're talking about. And I guess that's why we're also starting to talk about metrics that are, measures of GDP, for example, that go much wider than purely financial, because I think that is really, really important that we start to be able to value some of the things we're talking about here.
Brilliant. I mean, my own perspective, Sarah, is capital is always the critical driver. If we can get capital incorporating the concept that we're talking about, the principles, and start implementing it as part of investment policy, a lot of other things will follow from there on. The energy companies who are receiving that investment will have to play ball. So I think investors are a critical part of this community.
So I absolutely agree with you, Mike. I think, though, the more I think about it, the more I think there's got to be push and pull in that space, right? And when we start to talk about the role of civil society, but also the role of governments and regulators, I think there is a really important role in setting the kind of terms on which we either, on which we want these decisions to be made or measured, and what's important and what standards we want organizations to hit. Because I think it's just simply, I think you will get leading organizations slightly ahead of the pack on the matter of values and principles, but I think it's just actually too hard commercially to expect organizations to go way ahead of the pack. I think there needs to be a bit of a bit of nudging and a bit of kind of setting the playing field in a more formal way around this?
We don't have time to discuss it, but there's this whole concept of beyond value chain mitigation, corporates doing something over and above their net zero journey and climate risk. We're seeing evidence of this. It's happening, but it needs to happen on a much greater scale. I'd love to turn this discussion over to the audience, and I'll do that in a couple of minutes. But one final question I want to put to all the panelists. We've spoken about the importance of this. We've spoken about the role energy companies, investors, and governments need to play on this. If each of you could just talk to me a little bit about what you perceive to be the real barriers to achieving what we're talking about here today in terms of full incorporation of just transition and social justice principles into the way we operate the energy transition. So, Surendra, I'll start with you.
From my experience point of view, the first is the government policy. I think the word fairness has non-economical connotations. The government can be the initiator. For instance, they can promote fiscal incentives, like in plastic recycling. To give in brief terms, they should incentivize collections by tax concessions, giving depreciations, extra depreciation on the machineries for collection and recycling, promoting blending of recycled materials with the prime materials, promoting or giving extra weightage on goods which are made from recycled contents. That's the one part they can do. The second part, they should create enforcement of all the systems which they have come out. The barriers from the business point of view is that the economics of recycling have changed. Earlier, we used to calculate, while calculating the total cost, the cost of raw materials, the labor cost, processing cost, and then you come out at the total cost. I think when it comes to the recycling, for example, we have to take into account the external cost, which in a competitive atmosphere at this time, when you ask a plastic recycling or plastic producing company, can you make this at a very competitive price? They would not think about external cost. The cost, for example, of collecting waste at the end of its life, which our future generation have to pay, it must be included. This is one of the barriers which the business people fail to understand. When we can bring in our entire costing system the external costs, this barrier would be reduced substantially.
Great, thank you. Minister Velez, if you have time to stay with us, love to hear your perspective on what you think are the key barriers.
I will mention 5. So one barrier I see is the difficulty to ask the difficult questions. So it's a lot easier just to make technical questions. But when you come to political decisions, for example, stopping hydrocarbon explorations, but that is going to cost us something in the GDP. So those are the typical paradoxes that are very difficult to make because it is a lot easier just to pretend that we can continue in the same direction. So for governments, it is very important to raise those questions, but also it is a barrier because they are not easy to answer, and then it generates political instability. The second one will be how to make more comprehensive parameters and more comprehensive planning. So we have planning models that are not making or are not supposed to make those difficult questions. So the variables, the type of indexes, the type of analysis that we are meant to be doing in the public policies are very simplistic. So they are not deep and comprehensive enough to make the changes that we have to change, that we have to make. A third point is how to make local challenges or something that is globally relevant. We have this situation with the Wayuu community in the north of Colombia. Why is that globally relevant? And who is going to take care of that? Not only the national government or the regional government, but also some other actors, the companies, the multinational companies that have been there, the governments that have been importing the coal that for decades it has been exploited, etc. The fourth, I would say, is the policy regulatory systems. The regulatory systems are very inflexible, and we need to make like fast changes and accelerate the transition, and regulations take ages. So I feel that as part of the government in which we are, and we really come with this push to make the acceleration in the energy transition, we don't find the institutions to go as fast as we would like, and the regulatory systems to change as fast as we would like. And the fifth one is how to undo pre-existing conflicts and inequalities that have been created throughout the model, the energy model, the extractivist model in which we are. Because it's not only to create a new model, it's also to repair the social damage, the ecological damage, and those costs are enormous. And we also need to invest in those, and there are very few people talking about it, no? So it's like if we were in zero to start a new model, but actually we have all that luggage that really is very heavy in the government's perspective.
Sarah, final word to you before we turn over for any questions.
Indeed, and I agree with many of the points made by my fellow panelists, so I will be brief. I think the only thing I would add with that kind of corporate hat on is being really clear, and it will take us some time, but being really clear about what it is we're trying to achieve, and what is it that collectively we want from companies in this just energy transformation. And I think at some stage, we then get to the question that we've had in other parallel areas, to be honest, which is how do we measure it, and how do we internalize those externalities so that it becomes part of that investment decision and part of that kind of social compact as well.
Great, thank you very much. We've lots of questions, so I'm going to start actually with two global shapers that I met at the start of the event, so delighted to hear from both of you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Carla Gomez. I'm from Ecuador. I'm a global shaper. Minister Vélez, you mentioned the fifth point about inequality. And I think there's a very important point. Energy transitions are not gender neutral. And even though the renewable sector has a better gender balance, 32%, compared with the fossil fuels that are 22%, women need to have a better position to enter to this value chain. And I think it's important that we see women not only as users of energy, but also as a key producers in the entire renewable value chain. So I would like to ask you about how do you see that, and how we can achieve a gender transition too into the renewable sector. Thank you.
That's an excellent perspective. We are creating a just energy transition roadmap at the moment. It started 3 months ago, and we hope to finalize it by June this year. And one of the angles we are taking is gender from an intersectional perspective. So we know that gender comes also with ethnicity, and in Colombia, and I think in Ecuador as well, with territoriality. So what does it mean to be in the Pacific as compared to be in the Andes? So those kind of differences, I think, are very crucial to decide what and how and with who to make the transition. We know that, for example, energy impoverishment is a lot higher to women, and it implies a lot more in terms of their time and the time it takes from the family and from the children, but also it reflects in the difficulties that women have in order to create or to be engaged in the productive system, in the productive world. So we are taking those angles as well in order to create policies that are inclusive of those transactional perspectives.
I'm just going to, I'll come to you then.
Good afternoon. My name is Bato Kilisite, and I'm also a global shaper from Botswana, which is in Southern Africa. My question is actually for you, Michael, and perhaps the KPMG team. You said that investors are eager to invest in just energy within developing countries. Developing countries are saying they're struggling to find that, that investment. So fair to say it's not a money issue. And then the minister did also share that sometimes it falls apart when it comes to the agreements of what do the investors want, where they want to continue to extract, just that now they want to extract something different. From your experience and what you're seeing happening on the ground, where exactly is the gap, and how do we close it so that the people who say they've got the funding and want to invest and the countries that need it are able to meet and actually put a just energy transition into being?
So I'm smiling because I see Justine Roche from the World Economic Forum, who I've never met physically, but I've worked with her for the last 2 years on this exact question. We don't think it's a money issue. My view, it's a risk issue. And I talk to investors all the time about this. So they want to deploy capital. They have a stated mission to put capital into emerging markets. So emerging markets means many different things. We probably don't have time to get into that. When you get down to it, what the core issue is a series of risks. Political risk, risks about land ownership, risks, foreign currency risk, for example, huge issue. And that's, we haven't solved this yet, but KPMG are working closely with the forum and with, Justine, you could tell us, I think we've 20 or 30 other partners. It's called the, I'll get this wrong, the mobilization of investment capital for clean. Thank you very much. MICE, we call it in short. And for me, it's an initiative I'm incredibly passionate about. And the group are actually coming up with ideas. And all of the ideas are focused on figuring out ways to reduce risk. And that's where we really need to work hard on. And I'll restate a point I made earlier. Some of this is about communication. Sometimes there's a perception that the risks exist, and actually they don't. We need to understand the dimension of these emerging markets. This is not a charitable case. One of my passionate beliefs is the role emerging markets can play in the energy transition in areas like innovation, in developing new projects. So we do need to educate, we need to communicate, particularly to the owners of capital in the developed world, some of the realities on the ground. So I know, for one last question. I can't, I'm sorry. I've been told I absolutely have to wrap it. All I'm going to say is, first of all, I want to thank my 3 panelists, Surendra, Minister Valles, and my colleague, Sarah. An incredible KPMG team led by Regina, who spoke earlier, John McKellar-Lacey, who's our Global Head of ESG, Sam, and a wonderful team who put this together. The last message from me is, we need to build momentum around this issue. We're all engaged on the climate issue. We are driving as hard as we can. I use the expression, I used it with you, John, in the meeting the other day, nothing else matters. This is the mission of our life, but how we do it is critical. So hopefully today we've got some insights about how we do it. We understand the barriers, but we also understand the importance of this. So with that, thank you very much.